Innovation isn't a gift, it's a process. A simple, repeatable 5-step process that anyone, at any level, can learn with nothing more than a stack of post-it notes. Observe, distill, relate, generate, pitch. And that's it. That's how the world's most prolific innovators consistently come up with ideas that are new, great, and reliable. She's on a mission to teach 1 million people to do exactly that. It's a pleasure to welcome the author of Rethink Innovation, Carla Johnson. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. We've been talking about this for a while, so I'm happy we get to sit down and chat today.
It's so great to finally meet you and finally share your work. And you've been on that mission to teach 1 million. You're nearly there as well, which is absolutely fantastic to hear. But let's start with the title. That wasn't an over-pronunciation of Rethink Innovation. It's a very specific reason you picked that title.
It is. And also, I was very thoughtful in how, if you want to show the cover, how it's presented graphically. So it's Think Innovation. So I say in the olden days, when I was early in my career, we would have these paper memos and it would say like regarding what is this memo about? And so for me, that's what I wanted it to be. It's, yes, let's rethink innovation and who's involved and the purpose and how we all look at it. But it's regarding the way we think about innovation and really looking at it from all different perspectives and reevaluating what we think it actually is and who we give permission to be a part of it, or how willing we are as individuals to give ourselves permission to be a part of the process.
I actually still use so I don't know what that says about me. It's like I'm some old English lord or something. I'll be sending messenger pigeons to people. But yeah, I use in my letters and in my emails even as well. But let's start with the cautionary tale of the thirsty pet story, which you opened the book with.
Sure. But for me, I loved it. I love to find quirky little stories. And it was so fun to come across this story about the pet water company, because they have these high hopes. And I think, like a lot of companies, they looked around and they said, here's this amazing opportunity for us to be a billion-dollar company in a really short amount of time. And they failed to look at the signs that were right in front of them. So the product was, if you were a dog, it was like a beef-flavored water. If you were a cat, it was like a salmon-flavored water. Ideally, it was a health water. And the owner had been walking down the aisle in a grocery store looking at all of the options for your pets, food, care, all of these things. And he's like, the only thing we don't have is pet water. And as humans, we have the Dasani, we have the Fiji, we have all of our, Liquid Death, we have all of our waters. So, why should we not allow our pets, our beloved family members, to have the same quality of water as we do? So they launched this company, and when it first started out, it looked like it was just incredible. But what they didn't take into consideration is like the health impact of this water. And so it was, the cats and dogs were getting fat because of all the additional calories in it. And also they didn't take into consideration, like, these are pets that will literally drink out of the toilet. So their discerning taste was not at the same level as their pet owner's discerning taste. And as you can imagine, it just fell flat on its face. But it showed all the signs of what we typically think of, like a disruptor, an incredible innovator inside an industry. And yet it missed the very signs right in front of it, that the idea wasn't new, great, reliable, one that could actually produce money and sustain for the long term.
One of the things that story opens up is the question of a reliable idea. And we'll come back to that because it's a really important aspect that's throughout the book. But the only other things is, and I experienced this recently, I'll share this with you because you work as a practitioner in innovation as well. I was asked by a well-known brand to come up with a workshop for their senior team, an innovation workshop. And it was a person second to the senior leader who I was dealing with, and put the workshop together. And then I had a call, and I gave the call, and it was crickets, like not going well. It's the only time it's ever happened. It was so disappointed by it. But the problem was she wanted an innovation workshop. But when I talked to her, it was about innovation. And it turned out she wanted creativity, which is something that, yes, linked to innovation, but it's not innovation. And it opens up the thing you talk about in the book, which is you ask 100 people, maybe even 1,000, for their definition of innovation. And it's often very different. And an organization really needs to agree on what they mean by innovation. Maybe you'll share a bit about that, but also your definition of innovation.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I like to pull people and see what their ideas are. I mean, I have my own experiences from my own client engagements and from people I talk to after I give keynotes and things. And I love to hear their perspective. But I did this question. I put the question out on LinkedIn a number of years ago of how do you define innovation? And I think whatever number it was probably twice the definitions of innovation. And as I read through them, none of them were very clear. And two, none of them were definitions that you could read and then understand what behavior should I take next? What should I do? And I think that's one of the greatest problems that companies have that they don't realize around innovation is the word is thrown around, but nobody really knows what it means. Like if you and I are talking and I say, I'm going to go for a run, you have a pretty clear picture of what that behavior looks like. Now, the speed might be very different that you do this. Or if I say, I'm going to bake a souffle, you have I think we all have a general accepted expectation of what that behavior looks like. But we don't with innovation. And I see it in organizations' values. I see it in their mission and vision and all of these things. But without clarity of definition, employees don't understand what actions to take. And when employees don't understand a clear action to take, then they don't want to perform that behavior because there may be consequences. And I think that's one of the most powerful things that we have to understand. And even if there may be a definition, it's usually convoluted and complicated and, only certain people are going to be able to figure it out. But I believe innovation is everybody's business. So I define innovation as consistently being able to come up with new, great, and reliable ideas. And when I think of a new idea, it doesn't have to be something that's never, ever been done before, because we've seen a lot of amazing ideas over the centuries. But it could be something that's new to that industry. So I tell a story about the Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. And it's a children's hospital, and they had an error rate of 30% from the time a surgery was done until that pediatric patient was moved down the hallway to the ICU. And what they ended up doing is they pulled in the Ferrari's Formula One pit stop crew to learn from them about precision, speed, and process and things. Now, were the things that they had done absolutely new and never been done? Well, of course not, because Ferrari and Formula One pit stop crews had been doing them for years. But it was a new approach inside of the pediatric surgery suite. And those standards, they dropped the error rate by 20%, and they're continuing to slowly chip away at that. But that process and the standards are now incorporated into pediatric surgery suites around the world. And so that's an amazing new idea. Now, the second word is, a new great idea. And I think of David Ogilvy. He says, a great idea is one that kind of makes the hair stand up and gives you goosebumps. And it's more subjective. Like your definition of a great idea might be completely different than mine, but it gets some kind of like visceral reaction. And then the third quality is that it's a reliable idea. And a reliable idea is one that actually has a financial impact, grows revenue, cuts expenses, increases employee engagement, customer experience scores, things like that. Like there's a concrete outcome from it. And then I put the word consistently in front of that, consistently coming up with ideas that have all three of these characteristics. Because we've all seen the companies that are the one-hit wonders. They do have one idea that's new, great, and reliable, but they're not able to sustain that output over long periods of time. And so when I think of innovation, innovative thinkers, innovative organizations, they're those companies that consistently come up with new, great, and reliable ideas that we all get excited about.
And that brings us to that idea that you talked about. You call these companies or these people in the companies perpetual innovators. We better give a definition for that as well before we get stuck into the framework and the updated framework.
Yes, absolutely. So I think of a perpetual innovator as someone who they constantly think in the framework of the process that we're going to walk through. And it's not necessarily that they have a different degree or they're smarter or anything like this. Like I've known people in every kind of industry at every level of seniority or experience in an organization who can think like this. And we all know people who, if we see them in the hallway or if we feel stuck, it's like, oh, I can just call them and I know I'm going to get like 8, 10, 12, 40 ideas just like that. And it's because they're able to think in this perpetual cycle of how do we come up with the ideas and be able to articulate and share them.
By the way, I want to tell our audience as well, it's the anniversary of your book, and I'm delighted we got this episode out in time. So, an anniversary of the book. So, buy the book. We're only going to cover part 1 today, so we're going to leave you hanging for part 2. So, you'll have to buy the book to find that. But you start chapter 2 with another cautionary tale, and this is one that every innovator, many people listen to the show will feel salt in the wounds or old wounds opened up with the story of a startup in Canada and poor old Mohammed.
Oh, yes. Mentorina. So I still feel for Mohammed. So I was sitting at my desk in Denver and the phone rang and he was Mohammed Hayel Saeed. And he was an amazing thinker. And I loved his passion, his vision, his desire to do things in a way that consistently brought forward new, great, and reliable ideas. And so they had started a learning management software platform that helped students learn. And the interesting thing about working with this group is that we were able to get to a place where the reason behind why they were doing the product weren't technical reasons. They were truly to improve the lives of students. And I think that that shift for a lot of organizations and how that definition of why are we actually doing the work is a really important one that I don't think a lot of companies actually get to or take the time to investigate. So I give Mentorina and the leadership a lot of credit for that. And so Mohammed and I put together this, it was a strategy we were both so excited about. And I always ask people when they come and want to start down this innovation journey, who inspires you? Is it a brand? Is it a person? And it could be, a Taylor Swift and Anthony Bourdain, or it could be, a neighbor who's always coming up with quirky ideas and things like that. And Mohammed told me that the company that inspired him was Disney, because it didn't matter where you enter the brand, you always have an amazing experience, whether that's a store, a theme park, a movie, whatever it is, the consistency of that amazing experience. And so with Disney as our North Star, we started to say, if Disney created a learning management software platform, what would this look like? And so we put this strategy together and present it to the executive team. And, I'm normally very good at thinking all the what ifs through, but we were so excited about the strategy. And as Mohammed finished presenting it, I watched everybody around the table, heads nodding, yes, this sounds amazing. But there was one person I hadn't taken into consideration in the room, and I call him the CFO. I think anybody who has been in a meeting where something needs money, we have a finance person, but this was the CFO, who I call the CFO. And when Mohammed was done, the guy took his glasses off and put them on the table and pushed himself back, and he crossed his arms and he's like, "We're not doing this. We are a serious company. We have a lot of PhD, very smart people. We sell to schools and universities. They're very smart people. We're not doing something that came from a Princess Ride or a Goofy Dog or something like that. What I need you to do, Mohammed, is just go back and essentially do the things we've always done. Cold call, put ads in industry trade magazines." And I watched it. As I sat there in the room, I watched the deflation of Mohammed. And I think this is something that almost everybody listening can relate to at one time or another. When you're so excited about an idea and somehow how it's packaged, how it's presented just doesn't work the way you hope and think it should. And I think that really sent me down the path of understanding what happened in that room and how can we fix it so others don't experience the same outcome.
And we'll get to solutions as well, because your process actually helps there. There was some steps that Mohammed could have gone through as well, and that will help other people with. But one of the things that happened there is we've heard of ADD, attention deficit disorder, but this is BDD,
Exactly.
which is brand detachment disorder. And we've all done it. And actually, I both read the book and listened to it. I got the audiobook as well. So I listened to it and it was read by you. Well done. You did a great job. And you talked about this. You did it yourself. So even though you speak at conferences all over the world, you run conferences all over the world, sometimes you're sitting in the audience yourself and you're kind of going, yeah, that's not relevant to me. And we all do it. And I was listening to you talk about this. I was like, oh my God, I do it too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of ties in with, it wouldn't have mattered what brand we used as inspiration for Mentorina and presented that day, because the CFO couldn't see the vision of what we were trying to do. And it brought me back to, I was sitting at a conference in Las Vegas, a customer experience conference. And my biggest client at the time was a mining conference. It was a mining company. They mined boron. And I'm listening to the speaker from Zappos talk about their customer experience process and journey and all those things. And I'm like, ain't nobody in this boron mining company going to do any of this. And, as we do, I pick up my phone, I start checking my socials, my email, all the things. I look around and think, who do I know in this session that I can go to happy hour with? And I was thinking about it a little later, and I know that wasn't the first time I'd ever done that. And to be honest, sadly, it's not the last time I ever did it, but I call it brand detachment disorder, because it's this tendency that we have to dismiss how relevant another company's experience, approach, vision, whatever it is, how relevant it is to us because what we sell is different or unique. And I hear people say this all the time. That's not how we do things around here. Yeah, that worked for them, but that would never work there. We don't have that kind of budget. We don't sell that kind of product. I mean, shoes versus, mining materials. We're not that kind of company. We don't have that kind of culture. There's all sorts of excuses. And that's what I put together and just defined as this brand detachment disorder. And the interesting thing is, it applies, like I hear it all of the time. And it will be an organization that brings me in to talk about, like you said, innovation or creativity. Help us learn from other industries. Help us bring the outside in. And inevitably, they will say, that's not going to work here because. And it's some sort of psychological protectionism. This might not be working the way we want it, but we're so white-knuckled on holding on to the status quo way of doing things that we can't see that that's doing more damage than trying something new, that they don't see that the risk of staying the same is actually higher than the risk of trying something new.
And if you're thinking of tuning out, don't tune out yet, because we're going to talk later on about a brand transplant, which is actually the antidote in a way for this brand detachment disorder. But one of the things you made a great point about was complexity bias, and how if you're being sold innovation or you've bought in innovation, the consultants need to make it seem complicated, because they have a framework that only they can do, maybe, perhaps. But also, if it's simple and the rest of the company turn around and go, well, why didn't you think of that, dumbass? It doesn't look good for you, and you might be ejected out of the company. So I'd love you to share this concept.
Yeah, absolutely. And complexity bias it applies to every topic and everything we look at, is that we think something is only valuable if it's complicated. And what we don't understand is that the hard part is to simplify it. And so when I look at work that McKinsey or Deloitte or BCG does, lots of paperwork, lots of diagrams, lots of things. And it's not something that the average employee could understand. And I found a really interesting statistic when I was researching this book, is that 90% of innovation happens outside of a traditional R&D or innovation team. So if we think about that, if we've made innovation so complicated that 90% of our organization isn't capable of performing the action, we have just wiped out the most powerful and productive part of our workforce to truly change things. And so when you talked about that point about if people look at the answer and it's super simple, I mean, it seems simple after the curtains have been pulled apart and it's revealed. But when you're standing right in front of the problem, that's part of the blindness that comes is our own experience, our own history, our own way of thinking. And sometimes it's just that outside perspective that can say, oh, all you need to do is unplug this one and plug that one in. And like literally now it will work. It's hard for a lot of people, a lot of executives, it's hard to give credit to something so simple. But I look at the organizations. I mean, Apple was all about how much can we simplify this? Like what's, design is everything. Let's think different and let's make this as easy and simple as we possibly can. I mean, Netflix did that with video, with access to video and to movies and everything. Let's make it you never even have to leave your couch now. You don't even have to push a button to watch the next episode. Like they've made it so simple. But sometimes simple is hard. And I think when we look at companies who say, this is a complicated process, this is a complex situation, the assumption is that the answer also has to be complex and complicated, which generally also means time-consuming and expensive and convoluted. And in my experience, it doesn't have to be that way nearly as much as people make it out to be.
I always think that like you've done a good job if people kind of go, oh, that made a lot of sense to me, and it's not like they're having these huge aha moments. It's more like kind of going, we got this, we can do this, like job done.
Yeah,
when you're working in an organization. But I loved, so chapter 3, you move on to an idea I absolutely love, and we'll come back to it properly when we talk about the process, which is the brand Transplant I mentioned earlier on, because it was right at the heart of what Kerry Smith did with his company that became a fan company with a name that people would not forget. And the inspiration of the brand Transplant came from a deli company in Ann Arbor. I'd love you to share this.
Absolutely. So Kerry Smith, he had started this company called the High Volume, Low Speed Fan Company. So you can see,
forgettable.
Yeah, that very forgettable. Like
name.
I know the thing, and I still had to stop and think about what order it was. And when I interviewed him, he's such a delightful man. I interviewed him, and he tells me the story about they were all sitting around a table in a big warehouse, and the phone rings, and it's whoever is closest to the phone answers the phone. And they say, hi, this is the High Volume, Low Speed Fan Company. Can I help you? And there's this, as you can imagine, big silence on the other end of the phone. And the person finally says, are you the people who sell those big ass fans? And they heard that enough. And Kerry's a smart guy, and he has just an amazing sense of humor. He said, well, why don't we give the people what they want? And so they renamed the company the Big Ass Fan Company. But as he was looking at the whole industry and how it serves customers, how it designs a product, how it looks at the customer life cycle, he said what he was seeing is companies that were manufacturing and selling essentially a lower quality product and making money on repairs and back end kind of things. And then he happened to be in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and he went to Zingerman's Deli. And he said, like, Zingerman's is known for their incredible sandwiches. So here he is, in line to get his sandwich, and it's all these different cheeses, and they're local, and the meats and the little cards inside the case that describe the meats are so detailed, and the bread and all of these things. And then he gets up to the counter, and he said, it's not just like a high school kid who's working there for the summer or a part-time job. It was actually an employee who cared, whether it was a high school or not, and who could get into the very detail of the texture of the bread and how it blends with the meats and cheeses and all these things. And he said he was presented a sandwich. It wasn't just like slung across the counter. And he said that thing right there, that experience inspired him as to how he wanted to build big ass fans. He wanted to make the original product so amazing and so delightful and so trusted and quality that was the thing that made people buy. And so he said, essentially what he did is he took the ideas and the perspective and the vision of Zingerman's Deli, and he transplanted those into big ass fans. And that's what I call a brand transplant. And how you fix brand attachment disorder is you look at what is it, like what Carrie did is he looked at the details and the quality of that experience at Zingerman's Deli. And obviously they didn't sell sandwiches, but he said there's so much of that we can transplant into big ass fans that can help us be an incredible organization. And that's exactly what he did. And a huge part of why they were so successful.
One of the things I really took out of that was when you said to do it right, to do it the way he wanted to do it. Like Zingerman's will never be a Walmart. It will never be that big, because to have that level of excellence and to keep that level of quality, just like big ass fans can't compete with the Chinese, for example, you have to keep within a certain constraint of size here. And constraint's an important thing we'll come back to later. But I thought that was a really key point that cannot be overlooked.
Absolutely. And I think when I look at big organizations and what innovation looks like inside of them, there's constraints that smaller organizations don't have. And a lot of it is the legacy way of thinking, the legacy pace of movement, the legacy of everything has to be systematized, put into a process. And almost, if you think about big companies acquiring small ones, a lot of what made it beautiful and special and unique and desirable as an acquisition gets stripped away at scale. And I think that's what Carrie was so great at understanding and thinking about it. And he now runs an investment company, and he understands, like, those are characteristics that he looks for in these companies that he invests in.
One last thing on the brand transplant, essentially, but you work with companies to innovate also with their marketing processes and ideas as well. I love this one, which was, you say, for example, you met the head of marketing for Red Bull, and he's like, oh my God, if I only had the budget of Coca-Cola. And you're like, going, what the heck? This guy is an amazing brand. So we do this every year.
Everybody does it. Yeah. And I remember my jaw just dropping and thinking, if Red Bull is saying, if only I had, fill in the blank, it's just incredible, where I think we all have these reasons and excuses that hold us right back from the edge of what we think is possible. The if onlys. Yeah.
I really took that from the book, that no matter what you're doing, like, you can aim for excellence. It just depends if you want it. Yep. I mean, I don't mean that, sometimes things that aren't going your way, sometimes you might have debt or whatever, but I mean the imagination to aim big. And then obviously it's going to be a tough journey to get there, but do have them. And it's one of the reasons I love doing the show, is just to bring concepts to people to go and just think a bit bigger, just think outside the box, or get rid of the box altogether. But the box is important, which is the constraint. But the last one we'll share, I loved this one, was how the CDC used brand transplant from a totally different concept to totally get out something really boring about how to deal with pandemics or how to deal with hurricanes, etc., to be able to market to the public.
Absolutely. And I think this was one of my top favorite interviews to do, because it was with Dave Daigle with the Center for Disease Control. And the department he worked in is communications about preparing for natural disasters and then how to recover after them. So if you think of, like, right now, as we were talking in Colorado, we have terrible wildfires right now. You think about hurricanes, you think about tornadoes, any kind of a natural disaster, floods, any kind of a natural disaster like that. And as a communication person, I mean, my background is in marketing. One of the big challenges is just to get people to pay attention to the important things so it will change people's behavior. And that was a struggle that Dave, and he had two people on his team that they were dealing with, because every year in the Midwest in America, it's, usually late May through August, it's tornado season. And they're trying to help people understand, like, here's how you prepare for a tornado, like water, dried packaged food, some extra clothes, matches, candles, things like that. Put them in a place that you can grab and go to the basement, or, at the times in some places in the Midwest, cellars, which are, dirt food storage underground kind of thing. And people didn't care. They didn't, there were so many other things to pay attention to as summer was coming and kids were out of school. And it was one year when the hurricanes or tornadoes had already been particularly bad in Oklahoma, and devastation, and the tornadoes, they wipe out, legacy farms and towns and everything. And it's devastating to have to try and rebuild. And he said, we have to figure out a way to get people to pay attention earlier and sooner and deeper, because this affects people's lives and can help save lives. And they were kind of chit-chatting before they started one of their meetings, and one of the people on his team said, like, did you watch the last episode of The Walking Dead? And they were laughing because in that episode, everybody runs into one of the CDC offices to get away from the zombies that were chasing them. And they were laughing about it. And they said, oh, maybe that's something that the CDC needs to help people deal with. And then it was like, ding, maybe that's the connection. And that was their brand Transplant, is that they looked at something that was so popular right now at the time, so popular in mainstream society. And they said, how can we transplant what people get excited about, what they love? I mean, people were doing like zombie 5K, zombie dances, zombie raves, everything was a zombie. How do we transplant some of that zombie energy and excitement into our work? And he had an idea about positioning disaster preparedness as in we're preparing for a zombie apocalypse. And he went into his boss, and he said, his boss was Dr. Ali Khan at the time. And he said, I have this idea. Are you okay with it? And Dr. Khan said, I love it, or something to that effect. And so they published a blog that said, Zombie Apocalypse 101, like how to survive a zombie apocalypse. And they put it out on the CDC blog. And Dave said, we kind of covered our head and winced, and nobody got fired and nobody got yelled at. So then 2 days later, they promoted it on social media. And within an hour, they had over 60,000 hits, and the server went down. Now, mind you, a great blog post before this was maybe 2,000 or 3,000 hits. So he absolutely knew they were onto something. And what they had done is taking the same information that they had been sharing with people to prepare for this disaster, but now just packaged it literally like they're preparing for a zombie apocalypse. And they went on to put it into a comic book form and posters and all of these things. It was so popular. And not only did it help outcomes and preparedness, but Dr. Ali Khan was invited to speak at Comic-Con. And you think of two things that, oil and water kind of thing is the CDC's disaster preparedness and Comic-Con. It was just such an amazing story and a hit, and how they were able to connect and get results and outcomes because they were willing to think differently.
Brilliant. We set it up beautifully for what used to be called the Perpetual innovation process. Maybe we'll just say you've upgraded this, you've updated it, which is great to see as well, because obviously things change, evolve, and you've evolved the process.
Exactly. And in every part of creativity and innovation is iteration. And so I now call it the wheel of innovation. One, it's a little easier to say, but two, it just is a great visual for once we get the process going, it builds on its own momentum.
I like the Perpetual innovation process, the pit,
exactly.
But let's get stuck into it. And I wanted to start where you did, which is the objective statement and the idea that great ideas actually come from working within the box or working inside constraints, not despite them. And you give the brilliant example of Tim Washer at Cisco, the man who managed to turn the launch of a metal box full of wires, a router, the ASR 9000, into a Valentine's Day love story. So let's walk our audience through that and then tie in the objective statement and why do constraints matter.
Absolutely. And Tim is a dear friend. And he's, at the time he was telling me about this project he's working on, which is a new router box that Cisco was launching. And he goes, Carla, here's the typical process. Like we have we have the technology specs, we have the engineer, we do a video and we do a press release and we do a launch. And Tim's background is in stand-up comedy, in comedy writing. He was a writer for Amy Poehler's Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live. He worked for Conan O'Brien, and he's just a dry, funny, witty guy who ended up in corporate marketing at Cisco. And he worked at IBM for a while as well. And he said, I just feel like we have a better opportunity here. And what we talked about is sometimes the reason that our creative ideas or our approach to innovation doesn't work is because we aren't actually clear on the outcomes that we're looking for. And was the impetus for creating the objective statement, which is we need new ideas too. And oftentimes that's very easy for a company, to specify, to improve our customer experience scores, to, have a great product launch or whatever. But the next part is so we can. And I tell you, every single person group I've ever worked with struggles for this definition. And this is why outcomes generally never hit expectations, is because there's no agreement and alignment on what is it that we're actually trying to accomplish here. And I think so many organizations, we see it now, we're running at such a fast pace and we throw technology at it, we throw AI at it, we throw so many things at it, but we don't understand, have defined, or agree on what is the actual outcome we're looking for. And then we also say with these constraints. Now, oftentimes the constraints are budget, time. It could also be, Kevin in branding, allow us to present like that, things like that. So everything we do has constraints. And once Tim was able to define those clearly, then it was very natural and made sense how to transplant comedy into this approach. And as anyone, they study their profession. And Tim was at a comedy club in New York City and he was watching Ray Romano. And he said the way he talked about things brought people in understanding. He was talking about, in-laws and marriage and kids and things that people in the audience could understand. And the more he talked about it and made people laugh, the more he watched the audience lean in and laugh. And he said it was a group of strangers who came together, and a lot of it was based on just laughter and humor. And you watch people's walls go down and their tension go down and their stress go down. And he said, even though this is a box of metal and wires, it's a major purchase. He said, how do we take that idea of humor and relieving the stress and pressure of a buy or a sale? How do we put that together? And so the product was launching right around Valentine's Day. And he put together this video about, for Valentine's Day, a lot of times we think it should be flowers or chocolates or carving your heart into a tree and those kind of things. But now you can say, I love you with the new Cisco ASR 9000 router. And he describes it in the way that you would a Valentine's Day gift. And it was so humorous. And they didn't put a big PR campaign behind it. They didn't put a lot of money behind it. They put it on YouTube. They sent it out to the salespeople. The salespeople laughed. And then they would go into sales meetings and they would open meetings with this video. And that laughter right there made their tension and their stress and those walls go down. And all of a sudden conversations were happening that had never happened before. And he said it was a lot of it due to humor and laughter. And they were able to get 2 new customers who they had been trying for years to get in the door. And it was a beautiful way for Cisco to show up as a very human company, somebody that's relatable. And that's how the media and the analysts responded to it. And if he would have started out to say, we need to make the funniest video ever about a product launch, that would never have worked. But he understood the details of that experience in a comedy club with Ray Romano and what humor did. And that's what he transplanted into his idea for the video.
We're all set up now for the wheel.
That's right.
So, because the reason I thought it was so important to share those stories, and thank you for doing such a great job of sharing them, is they exemplify what the wheel shows. And one of the main things is observation. So observing Ray Romano and then kind of going, what if I transplant that onto what I'm doing as a marketer, or observing The Walking Dead, or the whatever the show is, The Waking Dead. I never watched it, but I do like the odd zombie movie. But observing it and then kind of going, I wonder if, and it's that observation. And you talk about the importance of this observation down to the fact that we should have an observation journal. If we're perpetual innovators, if we're always doing this innovation. So what I'm going to propose for our audience is, if you're listening, it's fine. We'll have empathy for you as a listener. But on YouTube, for those people joining us on YouTube, we're going to share the diagram, the wheel, and we're going to take you through the wheel, take you through the steps. So you have no excuses anymore, but you still need to read part 2 of the book afterwards. So over to you, and let's take it away with Observe.
Yes, absolutely. So the first step of the wheel of innovation is to observe the world around you. And I know I am guilty of having a little screen in front of me, probably more than is not only healthy, but productive many days. And we get into our habits and our rituals. We drive the same way to work. And so when there's repetition, our brain just becomes efficient. And it's like, oh, I don't need to pay attention to that or that or that. And so we don't observe little details. And I remember one time I rode bikes with my kids to school one day, and I thought I turned on one street and it was another. And it was like I had never seen this world before. And it literally was a route I had run 4 days a week for 5 years. But because it was outside of my normal pattern, I observed it completely different. And this is so important for us because the process of observing is neutral and it's not full of judgment. It's not looking at something and saying, is that right or wrong? It's purely sitting and looking at a comedy club experience. Maybe you're at a mall, or, you're watching your favorite TV show. Like, what are the little details that make it something that's so interesting to you? Is it how the character looks? Is it the litany of the dialogue? Is it the coloring? Is it the lighting of the scene? Like, what are all of those little details? And I encourage people to literally, like, I have a notepad right here, but I have notebooks I carry with me everywhere. And I'll write the date, I'll write where I am, and I just start writing down, what do I see? Colors, sounds, like, am I sitting on a park bench? How does that feel? Am I laying in the grass? Like, all 5 of your senses really, truly observe the world around you, which for some people can give them a physical discomfort because it requires us to slow down. And I think at the pace that we work right now, we think, I don't have time to do this. Like, I have to get to the real work. But this really is the foundation of the real work. And even if we're looking at what work are we creating, let's observe, is it being used? Are people responding to it? And I'm not talking about like the data and analytics, but just like between you and I and the conversations that you and I've had, I look at, what do you nod your head at? What do you find interesting? It's such a fascinating skill that I think we've been trained and rewarded out of. But it is the foundation of every single highly creative, highly innovative person, because highly creative and highly innovative people are also highly, highly observant people. And they see things that the rest of us miss that literally are right in front of us because they observe.
I think there's an important thing behind that it's not just that you turn observation from a passive thing into an active thing. It's actually, you're disciplined about it. You have a notebook. And one of the things that always surprises me is people will kind of go, oh, do you not run out of things to write about or thoughts? So I write a weekly article called The Thursday Thought. But I'm having conversations like this all the time. I've read your book. Like, I'm collecting dots all the time. And then comes the next step, to distill the ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And under there relies discernment. But distillation is connecting them
Mm-hmm.
and creating constellations. But I find it's just fascinating that, you cannot write or you cannot have thoughts if you don't collect the dots in the first place, which is observation. And then the distillation comes afterwards. Because if you collect enough of the dots, they start to connect and usually in weird ways, like zombie movies or whatever it might be. And that's where the marination happens. And you told me, for example, your book marinated for 5 years before you wrote it. And that's necessary, I think. But in there, those dots, the right ones bubble to the top and the right ones connect, and they connect in a unique way to you, which is a way to bring us to the next step, which is distillation.
It is. And you mentioned an important thing that I want to make sure to really emphasize is that the process of observing truly is collecting the dots. And we'll get to the part where we connect the dots. And we hear that all the time, like, oh, creativity is great. All you have to do is connect the dots. But if you only have 4 dots to connect, you're not going to have very original ideas. And that's why people who consistently and intentionally put themselves into new and different experiences, conversations, what they choose to read or learn or listen to or watch, they're collecting all sorts of very different kind of dots. But our brain does need to organize them, and our brain naturally loves to find patterns. And so the second step is to distill those observations into patterns. And they can be totally random patterns. It could be like, I remember sitting in Times Square in New York City, going through, and I had all of my observations. And as you can imagine, Times Square, there's a lot of things to observe. And some of it was just things like tall buildings or tall things. The color red, which is very prominent in New York City. And as we get further into the process, like just something as simple as that helps you understand what makes something else so successful. So during the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, where people would either pour a bucket of ice water over their head or they'd write a check, it wasn't about doing something dramatic and different, like in pouring a bucket of ice water over your head. It was about community. It was about something that was super simple to share. Like those were the patterns that came out of if you observed all the details of that campaign. Now, it would be hard for a lot of people in many companies to get an executive to say, yes, our campaign should be dumping the ice bucket of water over our head. But what you can do instead is to say, this was my inspiration. Here's what I observed that worked about that. The pattern here is that they gave somebody something very simple to share. Now that right there is a pattern that an executive or a leader of a team or whatever is much more likely to say yes to. So now we're taking something that's unique and different that we've observed and may seem like it has absolutely no relevance to our work or our company at all. And we're starting to put context to it and why it might start to have something to do with the work that we're doing. So that's the second step is to distill all of these random observations into patterns.
I kind of think of it also like you're whittling away. So it's like a funnel. So yes, it's a wheel, but it's getting thinner as you go around. So you're not going to have a random idea
Exactly.
to give to a CFO. At least the idea has been somewhat filtered before it gets to them. But the next one then is the one we loved, and this links to brand transplanting, which is relate.
Relate, absolutely. And I believe that this is the step that makes or breaks an idea when you go to share it. Because observe and distill are kind of outside in the world sort of things. And relate is where we take the outside world and start to bring it inside our own walls, our own teams. And if you don't do it or you don't do it correctly, this is where you trigger that brand detachment disorder of people saying that we're not that kind of company. Like the idea feels too risky and threatening. And so with Relate, it's really that bridge from the outside to what we are trying to accomplish as a team or an organization. And so the Relate is starting to say, okay, if the pattern is something that's easily is an idea that's easily shared, if it's about something that, is big and bold and red and tall, like those are things that we can start to relate into our own world. Well, if we're wanting to make our product or conversation about our product something that's super easy to share, well, now that starts to give us structure and context for when we go to generate ideas, which we'll get to. But it starts to bring inspiration in to the actual idea generation process that's fresh, that's different, but we've also started to minimize the feeling of this is a risky thing to try. because we can connect the dots and show the journey from what is it that inspired us and truly, literally, how does this relate to what we're trying to do?
One of the things people miss with the work that we do, say working with organizations, running workshops, facilitation, etc., is the language we choose is very specific, and that might be just an afterthought for some people, but there's a quote by Wittgenstein I love: "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." And in the book, I loved, you cite the work of Min Basadeur, this lady who did decades of research showing the words we use can actually kill an idea before it's even born. I was delighted to see you highlighted this, and something that people often miss. And if they're doing internal workshops or they're talking to a CFO, it's important what language they use.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm happy you brought that up. So Min Basadeur, he worked for P&G on the marketing team, and it was this. Yeah.
Sorry, Min.
Yeah. And it was this nuance of how we ask a question can shift the entire mindset around how we approach it. So if we say, how could we be as creative as an apple? How could we be as creative as, fill in the blank with any kind of organization? Our brain starts to answer that question. And oftentimes it will say, well, to be honest, I don't know if we could. We don't have that kind of budget. We don't sell that kind of product. We don't, our brain answers the questions that we ask it. Or we say, how should we fill in the blank? Your brain starts to go, I don't know if we should. That's a little risky. It might go over budget. It might affect my career, that promotion. I don't know that we should. And so what he understood is that asking the question in the context of how might we, there's no place for your brain to go to put on the brakes. And it's the meaning of the word might. It's almost like, let's pretend. There's nobody says this is going to be a real thing. There's no consequences tied to it. So your brain naturally goes, oh, well, how might that happen? Well, we could, and then it starts to go to work and it starts to connect the dots. Like, how could we be more shareable? How could we build a bigger community? How could we be, how could we be as interesting and dynamic and create a hunger for our content like The Walking Dead? How might we? And again, your brain is going, there's no risk here. Like there's nothing on the line. And that's when it really starts to open up.
It's so important, that language, I think, when you're selling ideas in a corporate in particular, where it's all about de-risking.
Yeah.
And that language. And sorry, Min, you subtly told me, hey, Min's a dude.
I feel I owe that to him and his work.
Yes. I'll have to check his work out. But in the relate step, we looked at how might we, which is important language that Min talked about. But in the generate step, which is next, we ask, what if we tried this? So we start to get closer and closer to that pitch that we're so much after.
Exactly. And it's, to your point, like it does feel like a funnel. And there was another piece of research that I found interesting in that we don't get to truly creative ideas until we've gone through the first 200 ideas. And if you look, like we've spent how much time already talking about the first 3 steps of this process, but typically what happens when we need a new strategy or an idea, we say like, let's all get in the conference room. Let's have our offsite. Let's get our ideas together. And there's no such thing as a bad idea. Everybody throw out your ideas and we know what happens. There's a whole lot of really bad ideas. And the person who talks the loudest or talks the most or is the highest ranking person, their ideas always move forward. And everybody else is going, well, why did we even bother? And I'm so far behind in my work and my email. And no wonder people have this aversion to creativity sessions or innovation planning or anything like this, because we don't give it time to get to that great work. And the reason the research says 200 ideas is because your brain will start out and dump the most likely, the most familiar, the most safe, the most risk averse. Like it's a little bit like AI. What's the most likely answer that you will say yes to? And we don't get to that new, fresh ground until we essentially get that out. We have to get that out, push it aside. And then we continue to push and almost go into the ridiculous, the audacious, things that are so crazy they could never work, but you know what? They're so ridiculous they just might. And that's when we get, it's so ridiculous that the head of the CDC's disaster preparedness could ever be invited to Comic-Con, but look at that outcome. Now, they didn't set that out as their objective, but it was an outcome because they kept pushing and saying, what if we tried this? How about if we did this? What if we remix this? And it can be two crazy and ridiculous ideas that come together and make a really amazing, realistic idea. Or maybe you've gone through this process a couple of years ago and somebody goes, oh, you remember when we thought about that one thing that wouldn't work then because of whatever? This would be perfect right now. And that's when you see the whole energy in the room and with the whole group of people begin to shift. The whole reason behind why we do idea generation is not to get the one right idea. It's to generate as many ideas as possible. Because in order to get to great ideas, we have to start with a lot of ideas.
I love it. And the next one, I'm guilty of this. So I worked as head of innovation, head of digital in roles in the past. And sometimes you think that your past success is enough to carry the idea through the organization once again. And you don't put as much work into that. And even work to understand the incentives of the CFO or the senior executive team, because really they're almost like a VC buying your idea and to try and bring it to life. So we underestimate the pitch, and your big reframe in the book is that the pitch isn't a sales ask. It's more like an idea journey. And if you do bring it the team on that idea journey with you, it has a way better chance of survival. But the one thing I want to emphasize is the amount of work we did to get here, and often that's skipped, or we might jump straight to the pitch, or we think that the idea is, we have loads of ideas and we think, let's try and let 1,000 flowers bloom, blah, blah, blah. And I think that that's the piece that we miss in innovation so much, is that it is a discipline. And it's counterintuitive for somebody who feels creative and innovative that they have to go through all this. Feels like red tape. It feels like bureaucracy, but it's so, so important, which is why I love your process. But let's share pitch, because it's so important. All the work we did to get to this point, and this is the point where we make or break.
Absolutely. And I always say bad pitches kill great ideas. And a pitch isn't just like, hey, let me get your buy-in. A pitch is truly telling the story of the journey of your idea. And I'm a big fan of Shark Tank, and I know there's a lot of different versions of that in a lot of different countries, but I was watching it, and it's one of those shows that seems to be on all the time on some channel. You can catch Shark Tank. And I was watching it, and a contestant was giving their pitch, and Barbara Corcoran, she's my favorite. She's like, no, like, stop right there. Your pitch is so bad that I don't even care what your idea is. I'm out. And I think that's so true. We don't understand. A lot of pitches start with data, justification, all those things. Yawn. There's no emotional attachment or engagement. And if there's no emotion, there's no attachment. There's no engagement in the idea. We really do have to go back. And this is the beautiful part about the Wheel of Innovation, is that by the time you get to the pitch step, you've already put the pitch together, because it literally is just going back to the beginning and saying, here's something that I observed in the world. And, I observed this problem that we're having in the company, which is secret. That's your objective statement. And I observed these things and I realized there's a pattern behind it. And here's the pattern: tall things, community things. And I started to see how those related to what we're trying to accomplish inside our organization or team. And that generated some ideas for me. You never want to go with just one idea. There's lots of different options. You have over 200 now. And it's a discussion point. And that crazy radical or whatever thing that you observed at the beginning now has flowed very realistically. And most of all, it has context as you've brought people through the journey of your idea to why you're standing in front of them right there and pitching and sharing that idea.
The last thing I'd love to share, which is so, so important, is the importance of feedback. both as a recipient of the feedback, if you've pitched the idea, but also if for example, and often heads of innovation will find themselves in this position where they're the judge and giving feedback to other people inside the organization. So you're not actually damning them, because they won't come back with more, because maybe you'll hurt their feelings or damage their ego in some way. I'd love you to share, because this is so often overlooked part of the process that's so important from the other side of the table.
Yeah, well, I talk to a lot of executives and I'll hear them say, my teams just don't come to me with ideas. I'm thinking, okay, there could be a lot of reasons, they don't feel safe. They don't, whatever it is, or maybe, they used to, but they just don't anymore. And I don't know what happened. And then I'll talk to the team and they'll say, why waste my time? They say no to every single thing that I do, or they give me so much homework, so much more to just do with this simple little idea that I don't have time to do that in my job. So why bother? And I believe that problem, that dynamic, is because we don't understand how and in what ways we should give feedback. So I think anytime somebody steps forward and shares an idea, it doesn't matter how bad it is, I'm going to be honest, we need to recognize their courage and bravery for being willing to step forward. Now, I personally have a very strong opinion about how to fix that bad idea, and it's a process called the Wheel of Innovation that gives them structure for how to come up with an idea that has a true business objective, how to put it into the context of the business problem you're trying to solve, and how to structure it and share that idea. So there's that part. But I think just acknowledging that it takes a lot to put behind they're thinking of the business. They're thinking of ways to improve. That's something that should be encouraged and supported and openly celebrated and recognized. Now, moving on, assuming it is a well thought out, structured kind of idea that they're sharing, start to go into, here's what I like about it. There's always something good in the idea. So let's get down to the details of what are the good things. And I think this is always really helpful to do in a team setting where other people can learn from that feedback and understand with a real life example, what does a good idea look like? And see the very detail. I like how you maybe thought through how it specifically connected to this one problem we're having with customer retention or something like that. And then the details. Now, rarely ever is an idea presented and it's just ready to go. So it needs to be iterated. It needs to be, adjusted to whatever degree. But it's important that how that feedback is presented doesn't feel like criticism. Again, what we're looking at is how do we improve this idea, not how do we make this person sharing it feel judged. And that's where, when there are opportunities to make it better, instead of it feeling like criticism and judgment, we say, what I wish this idea had, what I wish we could understand more about is, and look at it like this. And so what happens is, in this kind of exchange, the leader can be very specific and communicate what is it that they like about an idea, like how does their vision come into play with what's been presented. And also, here's what I'm looking for that I'm not getting in this idea that would not only help me understand it better, but maybe make it a better idea for whatever problem we're trying to solve. So that helps the leader communicate better and clearer, which helps everybody on the team. Now, it also helps the person presenting the idea, because it's not unusual for them to present an idea and their executive or their team leader says, it's not quite right. It's not quite there. Go back and flesh it out a little more. That means there's no direction. There's no feedback. Like, what does flesh it out a little more mean? And so they have a clear direction of, okay, I did this right. I need some more of this. This I need to dig into. Maybe this I need to leave behind altogether. And it helps both sides be more clear and have that alignment, back to that alignment about what is it that we're trying to accomplish here.
Fantastic. We've come full circle, literally around the wheel, and we've got to the end of the wheel. As I said, there's way more in the book. There's a way to understand yourself, what type of character you are in the innovation journey as well. But for people who want to find you, I know you do keynotes, you help organizations all over the world. Where's the best place to find you, Carla?
The best place is my website. It's my name, carlajohnson.co. It's not .com, it's .co. I say for the great state of Colorado because I live in Colorado. And there you can take the innovation archetype assessment that you just mentioned. You can sign up for my newsletter that's every other week that teaches people detailed ways to build their own innovation skills, their mindset around it, how they can look at leading their teams and truly building that culture of original thinkers.
It's been an absolute pleasure joining you. I look forward to seeing more. I know you've another book out there as well, and looking forward to sign up to your newsletter as well. Author of Rethink Innovation, Carla Johnson. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation.